The rain hadn't let up in 3 days. It spilled over the city like a grief too old to name, soaking the streets of downtown Chicago until they gleamed like broken promises under flickering streetlights. David Langford tugged his worn baseball cap lower, shielding his face as he stepped out of Romano's family restaurant, the hum of neon behind him sputtering like a heartbeat running out of time. His hand still carried the sharp scent of dish soap and fryer grease, a scent that had become strangely familiar over the past 6 months. No one in that kitchen knew that Dan, the quiet guy who took every extra shift without a word, was actually the heir to the Romano's restaurant empire. To them, he was just another worker, a man who kept his head down, moved fast, and never argued when manager Connor unloaded the dirtiest tasks on him. And that was exactly how David wanted it. Since inheriting the chain from his late uncle, David had come to realize something no business school lecture or executive meeting could teach. Real leadership starts with understanding the ground you walk on. These undercover months had taught him more about loyalty, struggle, and silent resilience than years of boardroom strategy ever could. But tonight, something was off. There was a weight in the air, heavier than the rain. His footsteps echoed hollow against wet pavement as he walked toward the L station, boots sloshing through puddles reflecting the bruised amber glow of the city's lights. He might have walked right past her, would have, if not for a flicker in his peripheral vision. The bus stop was the kind people passed without looking, cracked glass walls, graffiti no one wanted to decipher, the kind of place that turned invisible in plain sight. But tonight, someone was there. Through streaked glass, he saw her. At first, instinct whispered the usual, another homeless figure trying to disappear into the city's apathy. He almost kept walking. That was how city life worked. You didn't see what hurt. You just moved on. But this time, his feet refused. Something about the way the figure was sitting, upright but so small, folded in on herself like she didn't want to take up space. It felt familiar. Then came the flash of burgundy, a uniform soaked and clinging to the form of a woman who had no business being out here. Not like this. David stepped closer, the shelter's broken glass creaking beneath his weight. And then he saw her face. Maria Santos, his most dependable waitress, the woman who smiled through 12-hour shifts without complaint, who memorized regulars' orders, who could juggle a tray of drinks during a dinner rush and still ask a child about their day. She was the heartbeat of Romano's. And now she was asleep on a freezing bench, her purse clutched like a lifeline. At first, David felt his old instincts rise. Judgment, sharp and fast. Was she seriously sleeping here? What kind of employee did that? But then, he looked closer. Maria's uniform, always immaculate no matter how chaotic the night got, was wrinkled and stained. Her shoes, the black non-slip ones all servers wore, had holes near the toes, clumsily patched with black tape. Her hair, usually tied back, hung wet and tangled around her face. But it was the bruises on her legs, deep, finger-shaped marks like shadows of someone else's struggle, that made his breath catch. They weren't restaurant bruises. These weren't the marks of clumsy corners or heavy trays. They were the quiet kind, the dangerous kind. David felt his stomach twist, something icy and ashamed pooling inside him. He glanced at her hands, raw and cracked from overexposure to cleaning chemicals, shaking even in sleep. Her purse, held to her chest like a shield, had spilled slightly. That's when he saw it. A photo, face down on the wet concrete. He picked it up. It was a girl, no more than 8 or 9. School uniform, front teeth missing, mid-laugh. The photo was creased and soft with time, the kind of picture a mother folds and unfolds every day, holding it between errands, between paychecks, between heartbeats. David swallowed hard. Suddenly it wasn't Maria the waitress in front of him. It was Maria the mother, Maria the fighter, Maria the woman who smiled while quietly falling apart, who gave everything and asked for nothing. And for the first time in his life, David Langford, a man born into wealth, who had never wondered how he'd pay for a bus ride home, understood what it meant to survive in silence. He stood there, rain soaking through his jacket, staring at the woman who had never once asked for help. And he knew, with painful clarity, that tonight, everything had to change. The photograph in his hand trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something raw. David couldn't stop the memories flooding in. His mother, gaunt from too many skipped meals, always serving him a second helping she couldn't afford to miss. 2 jobs, endless fatigue, yet somehow she still managed to hum lullabies when she tucked him in at night. Her sacrifices had been invisible to the world, just like Maria's. Moving gently, as if the photograph were made of glass, David slid it back near Maria's purse. That's when he saw it. A weathered paycheck envelope protruding from the bag, ink slightly smeared from the rain. On the back was an address, scrawled in neat, rushed handwriting. 1247 Kenzie Avenue, apartment 3B. The moment he saw it, he memorized it. Not out of intrusion, but instinct. A pull from somewhere deeper than curiosity. Guilt. Maybe. Or perhaps it was the first flicker of something more transformative, a recognition that while he'd been pretending to live as one of them, Maria was one of them, and her truth was nothing like the game he had been playing. Then came the hiss of an approaching bus. David instinctively stepped back into the shadows. The driver paused briefly, scanned the stop, then shook his head and continued into the rain-soaked distance. Maria didn't stir. She didn't flinch, not even a twitch, and David felt something inside him fracture. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching her sleep beneath the dull buzz of broken lights and the soft percussion of rain on glass. The image carved itself into his memory. His mind spun with questions that wouldn't settle. Why is she here? What happened to make this her only option? And more painfully, how did I miss this for so long? By the time he turned away, soaked to the bone, David had made a quiet vow. He wasn't walking away, not this time. He needed to know Maria's story, not as her employer, not as the masked millionaire playing pretend, but as a man who had finally opened his eyes. The rain kept falling. But for David Langford, something had shifted. For the first time in months, he wasn't walking through life half asleep. The next morning, David arrived at Romano's earlier than he ever had. He hadn't slept. His dreams were haunted by images of bus shelters, bruised legs, and a little girl's smile frozen in a photograph. He kept hearing his mother's voice. "Eat up, baby. Mommy's already full." A lie she told with love, night after night. Slipping into the back office, David pulled up the employee schedule under the pretense of prepping vegetables. What he found turned his stomach. Maria worked 6 days a week, double shifts on Thursdays and Sundays. According to the time card logs, she hadn't taken more than a 10-minute break in 3 months. No vacation days, no sick leave, no days off. While others rotated shifts, swapped weekends, or called out when they were tired, Maria was always there. Quietly, dependably, almost invisibly. "Hey Dan, you're early." The voice sliced through the stillness like a blade. Connor, the assistant manager, swaggered into the room, coffee in hand, designer watch flashing like a billboard of self-importance. David closed the schedule screen fast. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd start prep." Connor chuckled, a sound more smug than amused. "That's the spirit. Unlike some people around here." He leaned against the door frame, his grin widening. "Take Maria, for example. Sweet, but you can tell she's a mess. Probably just bad with money. You know how it is with these people." "These people?" David's jaw tightened. Connor kept going, oblivious. "Single moms, man. Always drama. Always needing a handout. I keep telling Mr. Langford, we're tight, by the way. We gotta stop hiring charity cases. They bring down the whole place, bleeding hearts and broken clocks." David could hardly breathe under the weight of the irony. Connor had no idea he was standing in front of the very man he was name-dropping. No idea that every word he spoke dug his grave deeper. "Must be hard, though," David said evenly, his voice calm despite the fire in his chest. "Working that much," Connor shrugged. "Work is work. If she can't handle it, she shouldn't have taken the job." After Connor left, David slipped out for lunch, but not for food. This time, he drove straight to Kenzie Avenue in the same beat-up Honda Civic he'd bought to complete his Dan persona. The address led him to a narrow, aging apartment building wedged between a laundromat and a discount market with signs in Spanish. Paint peeled like sunburned skin. Windows were patched with cardboard, and the stairs groaned like tired bones. He waited. Around 2 p.m., Maria emerged with a young girl, Elena, without a doubt. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same wide, expressive eyes, same careful steps, as though even the sidewalk might betray them if they weren't gentle. Elena clutched a stack of library books. Maria carried a bag of cleaning supplies. They walked in quiet rhythm, mother and daughter moving through the city like they were afraid to take up space. David followed from a respectful distance. At the public library, he watched from the large windows as Maria guided Elena to a corner table. They sat together, Elena flipping through textbooks, Maria helping with math problems like any loving mother. But even then, Maria's hands didn't rest. She pulled out her cleaning supplies and began wiping down the table, then the tables around them. As if still on shift. As if rest had become an alien concept. A habit she no longer knew how to break. The librarian approached, concern evident in her posture. David couldn't hear what was said, but he didn't need to. He saw Maria's shoulders slump, saw the apologetic nod, saw Elena's small face fall in disappointment. 20 minutes later, they left empty-handed. No books, no joy, only silence. David remained in his car, overwhelmed by the quiet tragedy unraveling before him. This wasn't a story about an employee struggling at work. This was a mother surviving in spite of the world's indifference. And for the first time, David wasn't just watching. He was seeing. That night, as the city lights flickered like distant stars through the rain-soaked windows of his apartment, David Langford made a decision that flew in the face of every rule he'd ever followed in business. For years, he'd been taught that success was about numbers, efficiency, expansion, control. But tonight, none of those metrics mattered. With trembling fingers, he dialed the corporate line from his personal phone, lowering his voice and disguising his tone. When the line connected to Jennifer Walsh, the HR director who had worked for the Romano family for over a decade, he introduced himself as someone he wasn't. "This is a representative from the Hope Endowment Foundation," he said, making up the name on the spot. "We're a private charity that provides emergency support to working families. We'd like to make a confidential donation to one of your employees, Maria Santos." The line went quiet. Jennifer's voice, usually crisp and professional, wavered with skepticism. "I'm sorry, what exactly is this in reference to?" David leaned on what he had learned, not just from the reports or from being Dan in the kitchen, but from watching Maria survive with grace and grit no one ever acknowledged. He offered just enough detail about Maria's situation to be convincing without crossing a line. He mentioned the long hours, her role as a single mother, the daughter in need of medical care. Still, Jennifer hesitated. Until he said softly, "She doesn't need to know where it came from. Just tell her it's from a local organization that believes in supporting parents who don't give up." Then he mentioned the donation amount. Jennifer gasped. "That's enough to cover private school tuition for a year," she whispered. "Plus, medical costs." "Education changes everything," David said, echoing words that still echoed in his soul. His mother's words. Words she had clung to while folding linens at night and skipping dinner so he could eat. She believed that knowledge was the only treasure no one could ever take from her son. And she'd been right. After he hung up, David sat alone, staring at the phone. The guilt was unbearable. The gnawing truth twisted in his gut. He was using charity to bandage a wound his own business had inflicted. Maria wasn't the outlier. She was the consequence. Romano's paid wages that kept good people just above drowning, offered schedules that erased any chance at balance, and allowed managers like Connor to push the struggling further into silence. He thought of his mother again. How she used to say, "A real boss takes care of their people like they're your own blood." Somewhere along the way, he'd lost that. Not anymore. David didn't just want to help Maria. He wanted to change Romano's from the inside out. Not through hushed donations or anonymous miracles, but with real leadership, with dignity, with a new vision of business, one where workers weren't disposable and exhaustion wasn't a requirement for survival. 3 days later, the staff room buzzed with a kind of electricity rarely felt before a dinner rush. Gone were the usual complaints about broken coffee machines or stingy tips. Something had shifted. Maria Santos had received what could only be described as a miracle. David stood at the prep station, slicing onions with mechanical precision, pretending to focus while his ears strained to absorb every word coming from across the room. His eyes watered, but he wasn't sure if it was the sting of the onion or the storm brewing behind his chest. "I'm telling you, it's like she won the lottery," Jessica whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. "Full scholarship for her daughter, plus help with medical bills. They're calling it the Hope Endowment." "About time something good happened to her," Carlos added from the dish pit. "Girl works harder than any of us." David's knife moved faster. This was what he wanted. Elena safe in a school where she could thrive. Maria able to breathe, maybe even rest. But as the pride rose in his chest, so did something darker, tight and sour. Dread. And then, at 4:47 p.m. sharp, the answer walked through the door. Connor Morrison. Tall, immaculate, wearing a smug grin that could charm a rattlesnake. He strolled into the staff room like a man who'd just been handed a trophy. "Has everyone heard the good news about our Maria?" he announced, his voice rising above the chatter with practiced charisma. David froze. He already knew what was coming. Connor beamed, gesturing broadly like a politician working a crowd. "Been working behind the scenes for weeks," he said. "Making calls, pulling strings. You know how it is when you've got the right connections." David's hand stopped. The onion sat half-chopped on the board. "Wait, you did this?" Jessica asked, her voice tinged with awe. Connor's smile widened. "Well, I can't take all the credit," he said, oozing false modesty. "But I saw how hard Maria's been working, how much she's been through. I made some calls to corporate, talked to people who matter." David's rage was silent, but searing. He wasn't surprised. Connor was the kind of man who'd steal sunshine and sell it back as shade. But it wasn't just the lie. It was how well it worked. Then Maria appeared. Her eyes sparkled, not with suspicion or confusion, but with gratitude. She clutched a folder to her chest as if it held her future. And, in a way, it did. "Connor," she said softly, voice trembling, I don't know how to thank you." The room went still. She walked up to him, eyes wide with disbelief and emotion. "When they told me about the scholarship, about the help for Elena's seizures, I couldn't believe it. And then Jennifer said, 'It was you.'" David couldn't move, couldn't speak. His fists clenched, not in pride, but in pain. Because Maria, for all her strength, now stood before a liar with gratitude in her heart. And that gratitude was supposed to be his. But it wasn't about credit. It was about truth. And David knew in that moment he couldn't stay silent much longer. Jennifer must have connected the dots. In a world where corporate credit always floated upward to whoever held the shiniest title, it made sense. Connor had asked questions, dropped hints at just the right time, and positioned himself perfectly in the wake of someone else's generosity. So when the scholarship came through, of course she assumed it was him. "Maria, you don't need to thank me," Connor said with a practiced smile and a patronizing hand on her shoulder. "Good people deserve good things. That's how I was raised." The applause that followed burned in David's ears. He stood frozen, his heart hollow, watching as Maria looked up at Connor with teary-eyed admiration, like he was the man who had pulled her and her daughter from drowning. And in a bitter, quiet way, he had. Except he hadn't. Connor hadn't lifted a finger. He hadn't lost a night of sleep worrying about Elena. He hadn't stood in the pouring rain at a broken bus stop, seeing someone for the first time through the fog of his own privilege. "You're a guardian angel," Maria whispered. And Connor's smug smile stretched wider. "Just looking out for my team," he said, basking in applause that didn't belong to him. That's what leadership is all about. That night, David didn't toss in worry. He burned with resolve. His sleepless hours weren't filled with guilt or helplessness anymore. They were calculated, methodical, like a commander preparing for a battle that wasn't about vengeance, but about truth. If Connor wanted to be the hero, David would give him more chances than he could handle. Over the next 2 weeks, miracles began to multiply around Maria Santos. A pair of brand-new orthopedic work shoes appeared in the staff locker room, tagged with a note from a local charity. Elena's case was suddenly referred to Dr. Sarah Chin, one of the most respected pediatric neurologists in Chicago, who agreed to take the case pro bono. The updates to Romano's employee handbook: quiet and effective, mandatory breaks, emergency leave, a hardship relief fund for struggling staff. All real changes, all quietly implemented. Connor claimed every single one. "I've been working closely with corporate," he said during meetings and staff huddles. "Modernizing our approach. Employee welfare is the future of this business." From his station in the kitchen, David chopped onions with a blade that moved faster each day. With every speech Connor gave, every hand he shook, David's anonymity fed a story that was no longer his, a story Connor was stealing and starring in. And the worst part was, it worked. The staff started looking at Connor with admiration. The company execs praised his initiative. Maria trusted him. And David, despite everything he had done, remained invisible. What surprised him most wasn't the anger. It was the ache beneath it. The part of him that had always believed anonymous goodness was the highest kind. But now he was learning something uncomfortable about himself. Even the quietest heroes sometimes wanted to be seen. The call came during the chaos of a Tuesday lunch rush. The restaurant buzzed with office workers and clattering plates. David stood at the grill, halfway through a burger order, when he noticed Maria at the hostess station. Her face drained of color as she pressed her phone to her ear. Even with the din of kitchen noise and laughter from the dining room, David knew something was terribly wrong. Her hands trembled. Her lips moved silently before the words cracked through the air. "Elena! Honey, where are you? What happened?" David's pulse jumped. Maria's calm, the same steady demeanor that had made her the anchor of the staff, was unraveling right before them. She snatched her purse, her movements frantic and disoriented. "I have to go," she gasped, already halfway to the exit. "They called an ambulance. My daughter... seizure." The word hit David like a punch to the chest. He remembered the research: childhood epilepsy. Dangerous when unmanaged, costly when uninsured. Her daughter needed treatment she could barely afford. And then came Connor. He emerged from the back like a shark drawn to the scent of panic. "Whoa, hold on there, Maria. We're in the middle of a rush." Maria spun to face him, her voice cracked and pleading. "My daughter's in the hospital. I have to—" "I understand you're upset," Connor interrupted smoothly, his tone cool, detached. "But walking out mid-shift, that's not how professionals handle personal emergencies." David's grip on the spatula tightened. The room had gone still. Even customers noticed the shift. But Connor stood unmoved, arms crossed like a warden, more concerned about procedures than people. "Connor, please," Maria begged. "She's only 8 years old. They said she—" "I'm going to have to write this up," Connor said flatly, already pulling out his phone. Leaving without proper notice is grounds for disciplinary action. It was cruel. Not bureaucratic. Cruel. A mother was racing to her child's hospital bedside, and all Connor cared about was his policy book. Maria looked around, searching for support. Her eyes met David's, and something in him screamed to act. "I'll cover her tables," Jessica said softly, but Connor shot her a glare that silenced the room. "That's not the point," he snapped. "The point is accountability. Standards." Maria said nothing more. She just turned and walked out, her steps echoing like gunshots across the tile floor. The dining room eventually returned to life, but the energy had shifted. Something sacred had cracked. In the days that followed, Connor went to work on the narrative. It started subtly. A few sighs, a few comments over break. "I really thought Maria appreciated everything we did for her," he'd say, shaking his head with performative regret. "After all the strings I pulled." David watched from the kitchen as Connor poisoned the well, one casual remark at a time. "The problem with charity cases," Connor said to a group of servers as they sipped coffee in the break room, "is they start thinking the rules don't apply. Give someone a break, and next thing you know, they feel entitled." David had heard enough. It wasn't just Elena who needed saving now. It was Maria's name, and it was time someone finally told the truth. Carlos's voice rang out from the dish pit, sharp with disbelief. "That's not fair, man. Her kid was in the hospital." Connor's response was ice cold. His laugh, thin and calculated, cut through the murmur of concern like a scalpel. "So she says," he replied, tilting his head with mock sympathy. "But funny, isn't it? These emergencies always seem to pop up when we need her the most. Makes you wonder if some people even appreciate the help they're given." The impact was immediate and brutal. Servers who had once traded shifts to help Maria now claimed they were too busy. Customers who'd once asked for her by name were quietly redirected to other sections. Her regulars, the businessmen who once asked about Elena's school progress, who used to tip generously, now averted their eyes, suddenly silent. Maria's tips dried up. Her confidence followed. David watched from the kitchen as she counted out her meager earnings at the end of each shift, her hands moving slower each night. There was a desperation in her silence, the kind that came not from failure, but from betrayal. She began taking the bus again, riding alone, always standing at that same cracked shelter where David had first seen her asleep in the rain. That sight haunted him, the echo of that first moment, now repeating itself like a warning. And then came the moment that shattered the last of David's restraint. It was a Friday evening, the restaurant buzzing with weekend diners. David was cleaning the fryer when he heard voices through the thin office wall. Connor and Jake Morrison, one of the newer servers, were inside. "I don't get it," Jake said. "Why are you being so hard on Maria? I thought you were the one who helped her." Connor's laugh was different this time, deeper, darker, filled with the kind of cruel satisfaction that made David's stomach turn. "That's exactly why I can be hard on her," Connor said smoothly. "I made her, and I can break her just as easily." David froze. Connor continued, oblivious to the rage brewing just feet away. "People like Maria? They're grateful, until they're not. They'll take what you give them, smile while they're doing it, and then throw it back in your face the second it doesn't suit them. So, yeah, sometimes you gotta remind them who's in charge." Jake was silent, but Connor leaned in as if imparting some profound truth. "The scholarship, the doctor, the shoes, all of it? That was me. Making calls, pulling strings, being a leader. And the second she thinks she can disrespect that, well, what goes up can come down." "So, you're trying to get her fired?" Jake asked, hesitant. "I'm trying to teach her a lesson," Connor corrected. "About gratitude, about staying in her place." That silence, The smug certainty of a man who believed he was untouchable, was more violent than any scream. David stood there, surrounded by grease and steam, feeling something ancient and righteous surge through him. For months, he had operated in the shadows, believed that anonymous generosity was nobler than recognition. But now, watching his kindness twisted into a weapon, seeing Maria suffer for virtues she embodied every day, he understood. Silence was no longer a strength. It was complicity, and he was done being complicit. The quarterly staff meeting was always held in the dining room, after close on the last Thursday of the quarter. David had never attended, not as Dan the cook. These meetings weren't for the kitchen crew, but tonight would be different. This time, David Langford would show up not as an invisible employee, but as the man who owned the very floor Connor stood on. Connor, of course, was in his element. He stood at the front of the room, posture perfect, smile calibrated, a general addressing his loyal troops. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," he began, straightening his tie, "I want to talk about something personal, something that's been weighing on my heart." David watched from the kitchen doorway, still in uniform, hidden in plain sight. The speech that followed was a masterclass in manipulation. "We all know about the support Maria Santos has received lately," Connor said, voice heavy with false sincerity. "The scholarship, the medical assistance, all of it. And I want you to know, helping arrange that has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my career." Maria sat in the third row, her head bowed, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Around her, the staff nodded in admiration, all still fooled by Connor's web of lies. "Sometimes leadership means making the hard calls," he continued, pressing his hand to his chest. "Going above and beyond for the people who depend on you." The applause that followed was thunderous. David looked at his watch. 8:47 p.m. In 3 minutes, everything would change. Connor wasn't finished. "But generosity," he said, his tone shifting, "can sometimes be misunderstood. When people begin to believe that rules don't apply to them, that charity equals privilege, well, that's when leadership has to draw the line." His eyes locked on Maria. Her shoulders tensed, her face twisted in shame. David's chest burned. This woman, who had given everything for a job that barely gave back, was now being punished for surviving, publicly humiliated with the tools of his own compassion. At exactly 8:50 p.m., the front doors opened. Margaret Chin, senior partner at one of the city's most powerful law firms, walked in first, briefcase in hand, her expression razor-sharp. And behind her, David Langford. Gone were the kitchen boots and apron. He wore a dark tailored suit, his presence commanding not with force, but with the quiet gravity of someone who no longer had to explain who he was. The room froze. Forks clinked to a halt. Chairs stilled. 32 pairs of eyes turned toward the door. Jessica, the young server near the front, whispered it first. "Oh my God!" Connor turned pale. "I'm sorry, sir," he stammered, stepping forward. "This is a private employee meeting. If you're looking for—" "I know exactly where I am," David said, his voice calm and unmistakably in control. "My name is David Langford. I own this restaurant. In fact, I own all 17 Romano's locations across the Chicago area. And for the past 6 months, I've been working in this kitchen as Dan, watching, listening, and learning exactly what kind of leader you are." Gasps broke across the room like thunder. Maria's hands flew to her mouth. Recognition flooded her face, alongside disbelief. "The cook who stayed late to help her," David continued, accepting a folder from Margaret. "The one who arranged her daughter's scholarship, the medical help, the shoes, the policy changes, that was me." He paused, letting the truth sink in. "And I've watched you, Mr. Morrison," he added, his voice colder now. "Take credit for my work. I've watched you manipulate, harass, and systematically destroy the reputation of one of the most loyal, hard-working women I've ever employed." Connor's face had drained of all color. "Mr. Langford," he began, his voice shaking, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," David cut in, flipping open the folder. "We have security footage of you bragging about making and breaking Maria Santos. We have recordings of your conversations, where you openly lied about your involvement in the charitable donations, and we have written statements from 6 different employees corroborating your actions." The room was silent, but for the sound of Connor's ragged breathing. And David Langford, no longer hiding, no longer silent, was just getting started. David turned toward Maria, his expression softened by truth but strengthened by resolve. "Maria Santos," he said, voice clear and unwavering, "you have never done anything wrong. You are not ungrateful, you are not taking advantage of anything, and you sure as hell don't owe anyone here an apology for being a devoted mother." Maria's face crumpled as tears poured down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't born of defeat. They were tears of release, of finally being seen, of finally being believed. David's voice hardened like tempered steel. "Connor Morrison, you're fired." A stunned silence followed. "Security will escort you off the premises," David continued. "Your final paycheck will be mailed, minus the deductions for the damage you've inflicted on company morale and the dignity of our staff." It started slowly, Carlos clapping once, then again, then Jessica, then one by one. The entire room rose, erupting into a standing ovation. Maria was too stunned to move, her hands covering her mouth as she blinked back the overwhelming reality of the moment. But David wasn't done. Effective immediately, he announced over the cheers, "Romano's will be implementing sweeping policy changes. Livable wages for all employees, guaranteed emergency family leave, and permanent hardship fund, named the Catherine Langford Memorial Fund, after my mother, to support staff facing financial crises." The room exploded into applause, but David's eyes were fixed on one face, Maria's. She was still crying, but now her smile could have lit the entire dining room. For 6 months, David had worked shoulder to shoulder with his employees, learning how they really lived, how they struggled, how they endured. Tonight, he finally understood what it meant to lead. 6 months later, David Langford strolled down the same rain-slicked streets where it had all begun. The October wind brushed against his coat as he walked, not in disguise, not undercover, but as himself, just David. The changes at Romano's had been swift, and they ran deep. Within weeks of Connor's termination, staff turnover dropped to record lows. Productivity surged. Customer satisfaction soared. But more importantly, something intangible had returned. Dignity. Real transformation came not through press releases, but through moments, the kind you couldn't quantify on spreadsheets. Carlos, once washing dishes, was now a night manager at the Lincoln Park location. Jessica had enrolled in college with a scholarship from the Catherine Langford Fund. Laughter returned to the break rooms. Employees no longer flinched when management walked by. They waved. And then there was Maria. As David neared a familiar corner, he spotted her parked across the street. Her car, a slightly dented red Civic, sat under a street lamp, bumper sticker proudly proclaiming, "My kid is an honor student at St. Catherine's Academy." It wasn't luxury, but it was everything. The bus shelter had been renovated. New glass, fresh paint, no more graffiti. Yet David could still picture the exact spot where Maria once curled up with her daughter's photo pressed to her chest. "I wondered when you'd come back here." He turned to see Maria walking toward him, a thermos in hand and a warm smile on her face. She looked different. Healthier, yes, but also freer, like someone who had finally been allowed to set down the weight she'd carried for too long. "Elena's at soccer practice," she said, sitting beside him on the bench. "Never thought I'd be one of those moms yelling at refs from the sidelines." "How is she?" David asked, though he already knew. Elena was thriving, her seizures now manageable thanks to proper medication. She was flourishing at school, developing a sharp mind for numbers, just like David once had. "She's perfect," Maria said, beaming. Well, she's also stubborn and thinks broccoli is a government conspiracy. But she's happy. She asks about you, you know. Me. She remembers the quiet cook who never made her feel like a burden when I had to bring her in after school. Maria opened the thermos and poured him hot chocolate. She wrote a story about a chef who turns out to be a secret superhero. Wants to read it to you. David blinked back sudden emotion. I'd like that. For a while, they sat in silence, watching the commuters pass, each carrying their own burdens, racing toward their own finish lines. David thought about all the people he'd passed in his life without seeing them, really seeing them. How much he'd missed, trapped in numbers and forecasts. I have to ask, Maria said gently. That night, when you found me here, what made you stop? David inhaled slowly. Honestly, I almost didn't. I was halfway to the train station before something made me turn around. What was it? Your uniform, he said. I saw the burgundy. Something about it felt wrong, like a puzzle piece out of place. You weren't someone I should be seeing at a bus stop like that. He paused. I realized then, I had no idea what kind of lives my employees were living outside those walls. That was the first time I truly saw you. Maria handed him the cap filled with cocoa. Connor would have walked right past. David nodded. Connor was what I thought all bosses were supposed to be. And now I know better, he said. Now I know what it means to actually lead. Maria smiled, but there was something deeper in her eyes. You know what changed everything for me? She asked. It wasn't the money, though God, that helped. It wasn't even the school for Elena. David tilted his head. Then what? It was realizing someone saw me, that I mattered enough for someone to stop, to care. For the longest time I felt invisible, like I could disappear and no one would notice. But you did. You saw me. David swallowed hard. You always mattered, Maria. I wasn't paying attention before. Most people aren't, she said softly. That's what makes the ones who do so important. As the city dimmed into twilight, David realized that all the boardroom meetings and profit margins in the world could never teach him what Maria just had. Leadership wasn't about strategy or dominance. It was about humanity, about paying attention, about knowing that behind every employee badge was a life with unseen struggles, silent victories, and quiet hope. I should head home, Maria said, standing. Elena's got math homework, and I promised her pancakes in the morning. She turned to leave. Maria, David called after her. She looked back. Thank you. For what? For teaching me that leadership isn't writing checks, it's showing up. Her smile lingered long after her car pulled away. David sat at that bus stop a while longer, watching the world rush by, thinking about second chances, about everything we miss when we don't look closely enough. When he finally rose to leave, he made himself one last promise. Tomorrow, he would walk through every Romano's, not as a CEO on a tour, but as a man who finally understood that his greatest power wasn't wealth or influence. It was his ability to notice, and sometimes the smallest act of seeing someone changes everything.